The heavy oak doors of the Seoul Cathedral didn't just open. They groaned, a sound that sliced through the suffocating silence of the most high-stakes wedding in the history of the underworld. 500 of the most dangerous and powerful figures in South Korea turned as one. Business moguls, corrupt politicians, and high-ranking lieutenants of the Kwon syndicate froze in their pews. There, in the center of the aisle, stood a girl who looked like a ghost from a different world. Soo-jin Ra was petite, her slim frame swallowed by a modest navy blue waitress uniform. Her hair, usually tied back in a practical, invisible style, was now frayed and messy. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have a name. But as she marched toward the altar, her right hand was raised, palm outward, a defiant, desperate command to stop. Min-yi Kwon, the Iron Tiger of Seoul, stood at the altar in a tuxedo that cost more than Soo-jin's family home. His face, usually a mask of unshakable authority, fractured for a split second as he looked at the woman he had ordered his men to delete only hours ago. Behind her, the radiant bride, Jaya, gripped her bouquet so hard the lilies snapped. "Security!" she shrieked, the sound echoing off the stained glass. "Kill this lunatic, now!" The shadows of the church shifted as black-suited enforcers surged forward like predators scenting blood. But Soo-jin didn't flinch. She grabbed Min-yi's wrist, her fingers trembling but her grip like iron. "If you put that ring on her finger," Soo-jin whispered, her voice trembling but clear, "you'll be dead before the moon rises, just like your father." Min-yi's icy gray eyes locked onto hers. In that silence, the fate of an empire teetered on a needle's edge. But to understand how a waitress ended up holding the life of a mafia boss in her hands, we have to go back to a broken teacup and a secret that was never meant to be heard. Soo-jin's world was measured in the distance between the marble floor and the polished shoes of men who didn't know her name. At the Moonlight Lounge, she was less than a person. She was a ghost in a navy blue uniform, a silent witness to the smoke-filled deals and cold-blooded laughter of Seoul's elite. Every night, she carried trays that felt like lead, her muscles aching from 16-hour shifts, all to keep the shadow of the loan sharks away from her father's crumbling restaurant. The air in the VIP wing was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey, a smell that now made Soo-jin's stomach churn with anxiety. She moved through the corridors with a practiced, head-down gait, blending into the mahogany walls. To the guests, she was simply a tool for delivery, as replaceable as a glass or a linen napkin. Then she saw him. Min-yi Kwon sat at the center of the room, draped in the kind of silence that commanded more attention than a shout. He was a man carved from ice and iron, his presence a physical weight that seemed to thin the oxygen in the lounge. As Soo-jin approached the table, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had served many dangerous men, but Min-yi was different. He didn't need to brandish a weapon to project violence. It lived in the stillness of his posture and the predatory focus of his gaze. "The Blue Mountain whiskey, sir," Soo-jin whispered, her voice barely a thread. She leaned over to set the crystal glass on the low table. Her hand, normally steady from years of service, gave a microscopic tremor. As she lowered the tray, Min-yi's icy gray eyes flickered upward. For a heartbeat, Soo-jin felt exposed, as if those eyes could see past her cheap uniform and into the desperate secrets she carried, the debt, the fear, the dying restaurant. But the moment vanished as quickly as it had come. Min-yi's gaze passed over her face without a hint of recognition or interest. To him, she was a blur of fabric and service, a shadow that happened to be holding his drink. He didn't even offer a nod. Instead, he turned his head back to the associate beside him, dismissing her existence entirely with a single, cold exhale of smoke. Soo-jin retreated into the shadows, her face burning with a strange mix of relief and humiliation. She was invisible, just as she had been trained to be. She was safe in her insignificance. But as she watched him from the corner of the room, a dark realization settled in her chest. In a world governed by men like Min-yi Kwon, being invisible was her only protection and her greatest danger. She was the girl no one noticed, which meant she was the only one who saw the storm gathering around the Iron Tiger of Seoul. The following evening, the atmosphere in the Moonlight Lounge felt even heavier, as if the gold-leafed walls were closing in on Sujin. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her shoulder still throbbing from where Jaya's heel had grounded into her flesh the night before. She had been ordered to serve the private tea service in the inner sanctum, a room where the air was thick with the scent of lilies and cold ambition. Minyi had stepped out to take a call from the syndicate's elders, leaving Jaya alone in the suite. Sujin approached the heavy mahogany doors, her footsteps muffled by the plush silk carpet. She was about to announce herself when she saw through the slight crack in the doorframe a sight that froze the blood in her veins. Jaya wasn't the poised, graceful bride-to-be she pretended to be in Minyi's presence. She stood by the ornate side table, her face twisted into a mask of clinical detachment. From a hidden compartment in her designer clutch, she withdrew a small, amber-colored vial. With steady, surgical precision, she opened Minyi's personal gold pill case, the one he relied on for his chronic heart condition, a legacy of a life lived in the line of fire. Sujin watched, breathless, as Jaya swapped the white cardiac capsules with identical-looking pills from the vial. It was a silent, lethal sleight of hand. There was no hesitation in Jaya's movements, only a chilling efficiency. As she closed the case, a small, dark smile played on her red lips, a predator savoring the trap. "Soon, my love," Jaya whispered to the empty room, her voice a low, melodic poison. "The Empire won't need an iron tiger. It will only need a widow." Sujin's tray rattled almost imperceptibly. The sound was no louder than a heartbeat, but in the silence of the suite, it felt like a thunderclap. Jaya's head snapped toward the door, her icy eyes narrowing. Sujin immediately retreated, pressing her back against the cold stone of the hallway, her lungs burning as she forced herself not to breathe. She had seen the Black Widow in action. The woman Minyi was about to swear his life to was the very person systematically draining it away. Sujin realized then that her invisibility was no longer just a burden of her class. It was the only weapon she had left to save a man who didn't even know she existed. If she spoke now, she would be killed. If she stayed silent, Minyi would be dead before the honeymoon. The choice was a jagged blade, and either way, Sujin was the one who would bleed. Sujin's retreat from the VIP suite was a blur of shadows and stifled breaths. She ducked into the service pantry, her hands trembling so violently that the silver tray rattled against the counter. The image of Jaya's clinical, murderous hands swapping those pills was burned into her mind like a brand. She was a witness to a slow-motion execution, but in the hierarchy of the Moonlight Lounge, her word was worth less than the dust on Minyi's shoes. "You look like you've seen a reaper, little one." Sujin jumped, a small cry escaping her lips. Emerging from the dim light of the back storage room was Mr. Han. He was the oldest employee at the lounge, a man whose face was a map of scars and secrets, having served the Kwon family since Minyi was a child. He was a relic of the old guard, a loyalist who had watched the transition of power with a silent, heavy heart. I'm fine, Mr. Han," Sujin stammered, trying to hide her shaking hands behind her apron. Mr. Han stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the empty hallway. He had seen the way Jaya looked at the staff when Minyi wasn't watching, the predatory glint that didn't match her bridal glow. He had seen the accidents that had befallen those who stood in her way. "The Iron Tiger is blind when it comes to the woman in his bed," Mr. Han whispered, his voice like dry parchment. "But he isn't the first. His father, the old chairman, he died just like this. A sudden heart attack in the prime of his health. Everyone called it fate. I called it a tragedy that left no witnesses." He reached into the deep pocket of his worn vest and pulled out a heavy, tarnished brass key. It was attached to a simple wooden fob marked with a number from the club's private staff basement, a sector that had been sealed off since the old chairman's passing. "I've kept this for 2 years," Han said, pressing the cold metal into Sujin's palm. "I am too old to fight and I have a family to protect, but you have the eyes of someone who hasn't been broken yet. This key opens the chairman's private locker in the sub-basement. He was a paranoid man. He didn't trust the walls, so he made the walls watch for him." Sujin looked down at the key, the weight of it feeling like a mountain. "Why me?" she breathed. "Because no one looks at the waitress," Mr. Han replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "And in this house of devils, the ghost of the father is the only one who can save the son. Go, before the shadows catch you." As Mr. Han disappeared back into the darkness, Sujin clutched the key tight. The metal bit into her skin, a sharp reminder that she was no longer just a ghost. She was now the keeper of a dead man's secrets. The sub-basement of the Moonlight Lounge smelled of damp concrete and forgotten history, a stark contrast to the expensive perfumes drifting through the floors above. Sujin moved through the flickering fluorescent light, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every groan of the building's pipes sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to wear the face of a syndicate enforcer. Following the numbers etched into the rusted locker bank, she finally found it, locker 44. The brass key felt like a shard of ice in her sweating palm. When she turned it, the mechanism gave a sharp, metallic protest that echoed through the hollow corridor. Inside, there was no stash of cash or weapons. Instead, she found a small, leather-bound ledger and a sleek, black USB reader with a micro-SD card slotted into its side. Sujin retreated into the narrow gap between the lockers and the wall, pulling out her cracked smartphone. With trembling fingers, she connected the reader. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy, night vision video file dated 2 years prior. As the footage began to play, the breath left Sujin's lungs. The camera was positioned at a high angle, hidden within the ornate crown molding of the old chairman's private study. In the center of the frame was the chairman, slumped in his leather chair, clutching his chest in the throes of a massive heart attack. But he wasn't alone. Jaya stood over him, her expression devoid of the warmth she showed Minyi. She wasn't calling for help, she was watching a watch. In her hand, she held an empty vial, the same amber glass Sujin had seen in the VIP suite. "You lived far too long, old man," Jaya's voice came through the tinny speakers, crisp and terrifyingly calm. "Minyi is too loyal to your traditions. He would have waited a decade to take the throne. I don't have that kind of patience. The inheritance is mine the moment he says I do, and he'll follow you into the ground shortly after." She watched him take his final, rattling breath, and then, with a horrifying grace, she reached down and closed his eyes. She leaned in, whispering a final secret into the dead man's ear. "Don't worry. I'll make sure the Kwon legacy ends with a beautiful widow." Sujin stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in her wide, horrified eyes. This wasn't just a murder. It was a blueprint for a dynasty's extinction. She clutched the phone to her chest, the weight of the truth feeling heavier than the debt that had brought her to this place. She was no longer just a waitress or a witness. She was the only person on earth who knew that Minyi Kwon wasn't walking toward a marriage, he was walking toward his own execution. She had the proof, but in a world where Jaya controlled the narrative, Sujin knew that carrying this card made her a dead woman walking. Sujin emerged from the damp sub-basement with the micro-SD card clutched in her palm like a jagged piece of coal. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and purpose. She didn't need to be a strategist to know that every second she held this proof was a second her life hung by a thread. She made a break for the grand staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs, desperate to find Minyi before he disappeared into the fortress of his private quarters. But the world of the Kwon Syndicate was not one of easy access. As she rounded the corner into the main hallway, the air suddenly grew cold. Standing there, flanked by 2 towering enforcers in charcoal suits, was Jaya. The bride-to-be was no longer wearing her mask of fragile innocence. Her lips were curled into a thin, predatory line, and her eyes held the glint of a hunter who had already sprung the trap. "Searching for someone, little rat." Jaya's voice was a soft, melodic threat. Before Sujin could pivot, the guards were upon her. Rough, gloved hands seized her arms, pinning her against the cold marble wall. Sujin struggled, the micro-SD card biting into her palm. But she was powerless against their strength. "Check her," Jaya commanded, her voice ringing with feigned concern. "I saw her lingering near the master's study. She's been acting suspicious all night." One of the guards reached into the hidden pocket of Sujin's apron. He didn't pull out the card she had found in the basement. Instead, he withdrew a small, sleek electronic device, a high-tech surveillance bug. Sujin's eyes widened in horror. She had never seen it before. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Jaya hadn't just been watching her, she had prepared for her. "A spy," Jaya whispered, her voice loud enough to carry as Minyi stepped into the hallway, alerted by the commotion. "Minyi, look, she was trying to plant this in your office. She's been working for your enemies all along." Minyi approached, his silhouette tall and imposing against the golden light of the chandelier. He looked down at the device in the guard's hand, and then his gaze shifted to Sujin. The brief flicker of curiosity she had seen in him before was gone, replaced by a wall of absolute, freezing hatred. To him, this wasn't just a betrayal of his house. It was a betrayal of the small mercy he had shown by letting her keep her job. "I trusted the silence of this house," Minyi said, his voice a low, vibrating growl of fury. "And you used it to sell my life." "No, please, it's not mine. She put it there," Sujin shrieked, but her voice was drowned out by the heavy silence of the enforcers. Minyi didn't ask for a defense. He didn't want the truth. He looked at his head of security and gave a single, curt nod, the universal signal for a permanent disappearance. "Dispose of her. Make sure she doesn't reach the street." As they dragged her toward the service elevator, Sujin saw Jaya lean into Minyi's shoulder, a mock shiver of relief crossing her face. The Black Widow had won. Sujin was no longer a witness. She was a ghost in waiting, marked for death by the very man she was trying to save. The cold metal of the service elevator felt like a casket closing as the two enforcers shoved Sujin toward the basement exit. Outside, the sky had finally broken, pouring a relentless, icy deluge over the neon-soaked streets of Gangnam. As the doors hissed open to the loading bay, the roar of the rain offered a momentary shield. Sujin knew that if she stepped into the black sedan idling at the curb, she would never be seen again. Desperation lent her a strength she didn't know she possessed. As the taller guard reached for her collar, she slammed her heavy serving tray, still gripped in her left hand, upward into his jaw. The crack of bone was drowned out by a peal of thunder. Before the second guard could draw his weapon, Sujin lunged into the dark, slipping through the rain-slicked alleyway like a ghost. "Get her!" a voice roared behind her. Sujin's lungs burned as she burst onto the main boulevard. The world was a blur of blurred brake lights and towering digital billboards. She sprinted into the sea of umbrellas, her thin waitress uniform clinging to her skin, making her shiver with a cold that went deeper than the rain. Behind her, the screech of tires echoed. A black SUV veered onto the sidewalk, scattering pedestrians as it hunted her down. She dived into a narrow side street, a maze of street food stalls and tangled power lines. The pursuit was relentless. Every time she thought she had lost them, the sweep of headlights would cut through the gloom, reflecting off the puddles like the eyes of a predator. She scrambled over crates of produce and ducked under low-hanging awnings, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She reached the edge of the Han River, the water churning black and violent below the bridge. The SUV skidded to a halt, blocking her path. The doors flew open, and the enforcers stepped out, their silhouettes framed by the flickering neon of the city skyline. Sujin backed away, her heels catching on the slippery metal of the railing. In her pocket, the micro-SD card felt like it was glowing. It was the only evidence of a murder, the only key to Minyi's survival, and the reason she was being hunted like an animal. Looking at the dark water below, she realized that being invisible was no longer enough. She had to become the storm. With a final, defiant look at the men in suits, she vanished into the shadows of the bridge's support pillars, slipping into the one place the luxury vehicles couldn't follow, the twisting, subterranean guts of the city's drainage system. She was drenched, exhausted, and marked for death, but she was still holding the truth. Sujin collapsed against the damp, sweating walls of a derelict basement flat, the roar of the Seoul rain muffled but ever present. Her hands were raw, her uniform torn, and her spirit was a flickering candle in a gale. In the dim light of a single swinging bulb, she pulled up the final encrypted folder on the micro-SD card, a cache of financial records that Mr. Han's key had led her to discover. As the spreadsheet scrolled past her tired eyes, the blood drained from her face. There, nestled among the shell companies and offshore accounts used to siphon the Kwon family fortune, was the name of the predatory lending firm that was systematically dismantling her father's life. Golden Lily Holdings. A cold, hollow realization settled in her gut. The loan sharks who had threatened to break her father's legs, the men who had sent her into the service of the Moonlight Lounge to pay off a never-ending debt, didn't report to the Kwon Syndicate. They reported directly to a private account managed by Jaya. It hadn't been bad luck or a failing business that had ruined her family. It was a harvest. Jaya had targeted Sujin's father, knowing his desperation would lead his daughter straight into the lion's den, where she could be used, manipulated, and eventually discarded. The Black Widow hadn't just been poisoning Minyi. She had been feeding on the lives of everyone in her orbit, spinning a web that connected the high-rise boardrooms to the gutter-level debt collectors. Sujin looked at her reflection in a cracked mirror on the wall. She saw the nothing girl, the waitress whose silence had been bought with her father's fear. But the fear was gone now, replaced by a white-hot, purifying rage. This wasn't just about a mafia boss's survival anymore. This was about the blood debt Jaya owed to the Ra family. Every bruise on her arms, every tear her father had shed over those ledger books, and the ghost of the old chairman all demanded a reckoning. Jaya believed that Sujin was a shadow that would vanish when the lights were turned off. She believed that the poor and the invisible didn't fight back because they had too much to lose. "You're wrong," Sujin whispered into the darkness, her voice no longer trembling. "We fight because we have nothing left to lose." She clutched the microSD card, the only weapon she had against an empire, and stood up. The wedding was only hours away. The elite of Seoul would be there, the enforcers would be waiting, and the doors would be barred. But Sujin knew the secrets of the service entrances, and she knew the weight of a daughter's fury. She would walk into that cathedral not as a victim, but as the one person who could tear the mask off the monster. The debt of blood was about to be paid in full. The Seoul Cathedral stood as a monument of white stone and arrogance, surrounded by a ring of black-suited enforcers that made it look more like a fortress than a house of God. Every entrance was guarded by men with earpieces and cold eyes, but they were looking for a threat from the outside, not from within. They didn't know that Sujin had spent months studying the blueprints of the elite's most sacred spaces. She knew the narrow ventilation shafts, the forgotten servant passages, and the heavy iron doors used for garbage removal. Drenched in the remnants of the storm and shivering in her torn uniform, Sujin crawled through the dark, cramped service tunnels that led beneath the altar. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old wax. Above her, she could hear the muffled, rhythmic drone of the organ, a sound that felt like the ticking of a countdown. Her fingers bled as she pried open a small wooden hatch behind the heavy velvet curtains of the sacristy. She emerged into the golden light of the cathedral, a stark, grimy contrast to the opulence surrounding her. 500 people, the architects of Seoul's underworld, sat in a terrifying, expectant silence. At the altar, Minyi stood like a statue of granite, his hand hovering over the gold band that would seal his fate. Jaya looked like an angel in white lace, her smile serene, her eyes already counting the riches of a dead man. The priest began the final vow. If any person can show just cause why they may not be lawfully joined together. Stop. The word shattered the silence like a gunshot. Sujin stepped out from the shadows of the altar, her small frame trembling but her posture unyielding. Her navy uniform was stained with mud and grease, her hair a wild tangle around her pale face. The congregation gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a hiss of 1,000 snakes. Sujin marched toward the center of the aisle, her right hand raised, palm outward in a gesture of absolute command. The guards surged forward, their hands reaching for their holsters, but Minyi's voice cut through the chaos. "Wait," he commanded, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the waitress he thought had been disposed of. Sujin didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the elite guests. She looked directly into Minyi's icy gray eyes. "You told me I was nothing, Minyi Kwon," she said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "But a nothing girl is the only one who saw the poison in your cup. I'm not here as a spy. I'm here as a witness." She raised the microSD card high for everyone to see. "The Black Widow has already killed the father. She won't stop until she has the son." In that moment, the silence of the cathedral wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled by the truth. The silence that followed Sujin's accusation was so heavy it felt as though the cathedral itself were holding its breath. Minyi did not look at the guards, nor at the frantic guests. He reached out and took the microSD card from Sujin's trembling fingers. His movements were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a man preparing to face his own execution. He signaled to a technician at the back of the hall, and moments later, the graininess of the secret footage flickered onto the massive screens intended for the wedding ceremony. The congregation watched in horrific fascination as Jaya's true face was revealed. They saw her cold indifference as the old chairman died. They heard her boast about the inheritance that was hers the moment he says I do. The mask of the beautiful bride shattered instantly. Jaya's face contorted into a snarl of desperation, her screams for order drowned out by the low, dangerous rumble of the Kwon Syndicate's elders realizing they had been played for fools. Within minutes, the white lace of her gown was being dragged through the aisle, not toward a life of luxury, but toward the back of a police cruiser. Minyi stood alone at the altar, the iron tiger, suddenly looking like a man made of glass. He looked at the ring in his hand and then at the waitress who had risked everything to save him. He didn't say a word, but the ice in his eyes had finally melted, replaced by a hollow, haunting clarity. Months later, the neon lights of Gangnam felt like a world away from the quiet, narrow street where Sujin's family restaurant stood. The smell of scorched tea and expensive cigars had been replaced by the comforting aroma of her father's spicy stew and fresh rice. Sujin was wiping down a modest wooden table when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up, expecting a regular customer, but her breath caught. Minyi stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a Tom Ford suit or surrounded by a phalanx of guards. He wore a simple dark overcoat and a look of quiet humility that she had never seen on him. He had dismantled the syndicate, turning the empire into a foundation for the families his business had once crushed. "The loan sharks are gone, Sujin," he said, his voice soft, lacking its former edge of command. "And Golden Lily Holdings has been liquidated. Your father's debt is more than paid." Sujin set down her cloth, her heart finding a steady, peaceful rhythm. "Why are you here, Minyi? There's no more danger to warn you about." He stepped further into the warm, humble light of the shop, looking around at the simple life he had once looked down upon. "I spent 36 years being a boss," he said, meeting her eyes with a sincerity that made her blush. "I realized I never learned how to be a man. I was hopping. If the waitress who saved my life isn't too busy, she might show me where to start." Sujin smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She pulled out a chair for him, not as a servant, but as an equal. The story that had begun with a broken teacup in a house of shadows was finally finding its light.